12-year-old boy without a single ticket in his pocket, yet possessing a depth of knowledge that, in that very moment, became the last hope for the 180 souls aboard a passenger jet. Never before in the history of Rome's Fiumicino airport had such an incident occurred. Today, listen to the incredible story of an invisible passenger who risked everything to conquer the sky. The morning at Leonardo da Vinci Fiumicino Airport was a symphony of orchestrated chaos. The terminal was a labyrinth of echoing announcements in melodic Italian and clipped English, the rhythmic clatter of rolling suitcases, and the frantic energy of travelers rushing toward their gates. Among the sea of business suits and vacationers, a 12-year-old boy named Riccardo moved like a shadow. He was thin, almost fragile, wearing a frayed shirt that had seen better days, trousers worn at the knees, and scuffed shoes held together by sheer willpower and frayed laces. Riccardo was not an employee of the airport, nor was he a passenger. He lived in the fringes of the vast parking area, surviving by selling small bottles of water to tourists or wiping down the windshields of luxury cars for a few stray euros. But his heart didn't beat for coins. It pulsed to the rhythm of jet engines. Whenever an aircraft surged down the tarmac, vibrating the very ground he stood on, Riccardo would stand mesmerized, his eyes tracking the massive wings as they pierced the sky. His father, Mario, had been a legendary ground technician at this very airport until a tragic accident years ago. Mario had taught his son that machines were not just metal, they were living, breathing entities with a language of their own. "Listen to the harmony of the engine, Riccardo," he would whisper. "If the melody falters, the bird is in pain." That Tuesday, Riccardo's focus was captured by Italia Air IA-902, a sleek, wide-bodied aircraft destined for Paris. It was a new generation machine, a masterpiece of modern engineering. As boarding commenced at Gate 22, the crowd was an ocean of bodies. Security was focused on baggage and identification, not the small, agile boy hiding behind a catering trolley. An audacious, reckless idea blossomed in Riccardo's mind. Just to see the inside, just for a moment. He donned a discarded catering apron he had found near the loading bay, gripped a plastic food crate as if he were part of the crew, and strode toward the service entrance. His heart was a drum against his ribs. His palms were slick with a cold, terrifying sweat. He slipped past the heavy service doors and navigated the labyrinthine stairs, finally emerging into the aircraft's rear galley. The air inside was crisp, chilled by the sophisticated climate control system. Flight attendants were busy welcoming the first-class passengers at the front. Their laughter and professional greetings drifted down the aisle. Riccardo didn't hesitate. He scrambled to the very last row of economy seating, spotted a storage compartment that had been left slightly ajar by a distracted cleaner, and folded his small frame into the dark, cramped space. Moments later, the heavy thud of the cabin door signaled the end of his escape route. He felt the pushback, the rumble of the tug, and then the majestic, spine-tingling roar of the engines coming to life. Riccardo squeezed his eyes shut. The plane began its steady taxi, and as it hit the runway, the acceleration pinned him against the compartment wall. He felt the lift, a sudden exhilarating weightlessness as the aircraft claimed the sky. He was truly flying. He had done the impossible. But as the plane leveled out at 30,000 feet, his euphoria was shattered. Above the drone of the engines, he heard a sound, a jarring, dissonant rasp like metal teeth gnashing against steel. It was a rhythmic, frantic clicking that vibrated through the floorboards. Riccardo's blood went cold. He shifted his position, pressing his ear against the thin wall of the compartment. He knew that sound. It was the frantic, agonizing scream of a compressor blade beginning to fail. He felt a sudden, violent shudder ripple through the fuselage, followed by a slight dip in the altitude. Passengers in the back started to whisper, looking around in confusion. The cabin lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the rows of seats. Riccardo knew the physics of it. If that blade disintegrated, it would tear through the housing, potentially severing the fuel lines. He had to act. He had to be heard. He shoved the compartment door open, spilling into the aisle. A woman in the last seat screamed, "Who are you? How did you get on this flight?" Riccardo didn't look at her. His eyes were locked on the cockpit door, his mind racing through his father's old lessons. The plane banked sharply to the right, and the engine's whine rose to a piercing mechanical shriek. He pushed past the stunned woman and sprinted toward the front of the plane, ignoring the flight attendant who reached out to grab him, her face a mask of shock. The turbulence intensified, tossing passengers like rag dolls, but Riccardo kept his balance. He had to reach the pilots. The harmony of the machine had been broken, and silence was not an option. The aisle of the aircraft, which moments ago had felt like a mundane corridor, now transformed into a tilting, vibrating tunnel of pure panic. Riccardo scrambled forward, his bare feet gripping the carpeted floor as the massive Airbus groaned under the strain of the failing engine. The overhead bins rattled with a sound like distant thunder, and a collective gasp rose from the passengers as the plane executed a sharp, jarring tilt to the starboard side. "Stop, you! Get back to your seat!" The lead flight attendant, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair, shouted over the roar of the ventilation system. She lunged for him, her hand narrowly missing the collar of his frayed shirt. But Riccardo was like a startled bird, nimble and desperate. He ducked under her outstretched arm, his eyes locked on the heavy, reinforced door of the cockpit. He knew that if he didn't reach the captain, the structural integrity of the wing would fail, and gravity would reclaim this metal bird with lethal intent. "Listen to me," Riccardo screamed, his young voice cutting through the rising cacophony of crying infants and panicked murmurs. "The turbine, it's not a stall, it's a structural failure in the compressor stage. You have to dump the RPMs now." The flight attendant, now pale and visibly trembling, reached for the internal phone. "Captain, there's an intruder, a child. He's shouting something about the engine." She stopped, her eyes widening as the plane gave another violent, sickening shudder. A loose panel in the ceiling overhead popped open, showering the aisle with gray dust. The plane dipped sharply, throwing the women against a bulkhead. Riccardo didn't stop. He threw himself against the heavy cockpit door, slamming his small, calloused fist against the reinforced metal. "Captain, sir, the harmony is gone. The blade is misaligned." Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and high-stress sweat. Captain Alessandro, a man with 20 years of experience in the skies above Italy, was staring at a screen that had turned a malignant, pulsing red. Beside him, his first officer, Marco, was wrestling with the side stick, his forehead beaded with sweat. "Captain, right engine 2 is spiking. The vibration sensors are off the charts," Marco yelled, his voice strained. "We have a structural resonance." Suddenly, the cockpit intercom crackled with a frantic voice that didn't belong to the cabin crew. It was thin, urgent, and technically precise. "Compressor stage failure. If you don't bring the throttle to idle, the housing will shatter. Please, sir." Alessandro's hand hovered over the throttle levers. "Who is that?" he hissed, his eyes darting to the monitor. The data matched the boy's words. The vibration wasn't just erratic, it was rhythmic, suggesting a mechanical object trapped within the turbine's rotation. "Marco, look at the vibration frequency. It matches the spool speed perfectly. The boy, he's right." Alessandro didn't hesitate. With a decisive shove, he pulled the right throttle back to idle, silencing the angry roar of the engine. The change in the plane's attitude was instantaneous. The violent shaking smoothed into a low, menacing thrum, though the red warning lights remained. Outside the door, Riccardo stood panting, his forehead pressed against the cool steel. The silence from the cockpit felt like an eternity. Finally, the door creaked open, revealing the stern, sweat-drenched face of Captain Alessandro. He looked down, expecting to see a passenger, but instead found a 12-year-old boy with wild hair and dirt-streaked cheeks. "How?" the captain asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the remaining engine. "My father," Riccardo gasped, his breath hitching. "He used to say the machine hums when it's happy. Right now, it's screaming in pain. You have a fragment loose in the intake, sir. If you keep the RPMs up, centrifugal force will turn it into a projectile. It will blow the engine cowling apart." The first officer looked at his displays, then back at Riccardo, his jaw dropped in disbelief. "Captain, the vibration index is stabilizing, but the engine is still hot. We're losing fuel pressure." Riccardo stood tall, his fear replaced by a strange, calm clarity, the same focus his father once had while hunched over a workbench in the dark workshops of Fiumicino. "You can't relight it," Riccardo added firmly. "If you try, the vibration will rip the engine off the wing. You have to fly it home on one engine, but you have to keep the speed balanced. If you tilt too far to the left, the drag from the right side will pull us into a spin." The captain gripped the doorframe, his eyes softening as he looked at the boy. He wasn't looking at a passenger, he was looking at an aviator. "What's your name, son?" the captain asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of the remaining engine. "Riccardo," the boy whispered, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving him shaky and exhausted. "Well, Riccardo," Alessandro said, moving aside to reveal the empty jump seat behind the cockpit console. "It seems you're our unofficial advisor today. Get in, we have a flight to land, and the winds over Rome are picking up." As Riccardo stepped into the cockpit, he felt the heavy thrum of the plane beneath his feet. He looked at the vast cloud-streaked blue of the Mediterranean sky through the windshield, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking at the plane from the ground, he was part of the machine. The journey was far from over, and the landing ahead would be the most difficult test of his life. But as he sat in the jump seat, he felt that he wasn't just a boy from the parking lot anymore. He was a bridge between the earth he had left and the sky he was destined to command. The cockpit was a world away from the panic in the cabin. Here, the hum of the remaining left engine was a steady, rhythmic heartbeat, but the silence between the crew was heavy with the weight of impending gravity. Riccardo sat in the jump seat, his small hands gripped tightly on his knees, his eyes darting across the maze of dials, glowing liquid crystal displays, and switches that seemed to breathe with life. "Okay, kid," Captain Alessandro said, his voice calm yet underscored with a raw edge of professional urgency. "We are 120 nautical miles from Fiumicino. We've declared an emergency with Rome Control. We have the runway, but the structure is the problem. Every time we adjust the flaps, the vibration ripples through the starboard wing." Riccardo leaned forward, his focus absolute. He could hear it, not just the engine, but the structural groan of the fuselage. He closed his eyes, filtering out the chatter of the radios, the beeps of the navigation system, and the nervous breathing of the first officer, Marco. He listened to the air flowing over the wings. "Sir," Riccardo said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "The fragment in the turbine housing is shifting. It's like a loose pebble in a spinning bowl. If you descend too quickly, the air pressure will force it deeper into the blade assembly. You need to keep the pitch shallow. If you drop the nose, the vibration will shatter the cowling completely." Alessandro exchanged a look with Marco. It was a look of profound, bewildered respect. "He's been correct about every variable so far, Captain," Marco muttered, his hands dancing across the flight computer. "If we follow his trajectory, we'll be coming in hot, but we'll keep the stress off the right wing." "Prepare for a shallow descent," Alessandro commanded. As the aircraft began its long, elegant slide toward the Roman coastline, the sky outside transformed. The bright Mediterranean blue deepened into a bruised purple, and the first wisps of storm clouds began to claw at the windows. Fiumicino lay beneath them, a collection of tiny glowing jewels against the darkening earth. But as the altitude dropped, the atmospheric pressure began to press harder against the aircraft's skin. Riccardo felt the shift in the machine's balance before the instruments did. The vibration in the floor became a distinct high-pitched thrumming. He turned to the captain. "It's moving, sir. The vibration frequency is shifting higher. It's locked against the main shaft now." "That's bad," Marco whispered, his knuckles white against the control yoke. "That's very bad." "We're losing hydraulic pressure on the right side," Alessandro noted, glancing at the gauges. "The vibration is shaking the lines loose. We're losing the spoilers. Riccardo, if we lose the hydraulics, we lose the steering control on the right wing. How do we compensate?" Riccardo felt a sudden surge of memory. His father, Mario, standing in the grease-stained workshop, showing him a diagram of a landing gear actuator. "If the pressure drops, you have to use the differential thrust," his father's voice echoed in his mind. "Use the rudder trim, sir," Riccardo said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "Don't touch the spoilers. If you try to force the right wing down, the hydraulic line will burst from the pressure spike. Balance the lift with the left wing flaps and use the engine torque to pivot." The captain's eyes widened. "Differential torque? That's a risky maneuver for a craft this size, especially with a dead engine on one side." "It's the only way to keep the wing attached until the wheels hit the tarmac." The plane groaned. A loud bang echoed through the fuselage as a piece of the right wing cowling finally gave way, flapping in the wind like a wounded bird. The plane veered violently to the right, dragging them toward the sea. The lights of the airport skewed off-center. Passengers were now fully aware of the peril. Screams of terror filtered through the reinforced door. Alessandro fought the controls, his muscles straining against the weight of the massive jet. "I can't hold it," he shouted. "She's fighting back." "Now, sir," Riccardo cried out, pointing to the power settings. "Give it 30% throttle on the left engine and drop the landing gear. It will act as a windbreak and stabilize the drag." Alessandro obeyed, slamming the throttle forward. The plane roared, shuddering under the sudden imbalance of power. For a terrifying second, the aircraft seemed to stall in midair, hanging suspended over the dark waters of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Then, with a massive thud, the landing gear locked into place, the drag correcting their trajectory as if by magic. The runway appeared ahead, a long, illuminated ribbon of salvation. The storm was closing in, rain slashing against the windshield like silver needles. They were coming in fast, too fast. But as the runway lights rushed to meet them, the vibration suddenly vanished, replaced by a terrifying, absolute silence from the right wing. "We've lost the right strut," Marco yelled. Riccardo didn't flinch. "Hold the center line, sir. Don't level the wings until the wheels touch. Let the landing gear take the impact. If you level it now, the right wing will snap." Alessandro gritted his teeth, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. The ground rushed up to greet them, a blurred mosaic of tarmac and emergency vehicles with their strobe lights spinning in the rain. This was it, the moment between life and death. The machine was screaming, but Riccardo was whispering the secret to its survival. The world outside the cockpit window had become a blur of strobe lights in rain-slicked concrete. The Boeing was descending like a falling star, its massive weight straining against the dying hydraulics of the right wing. Inside the cockpit, the tension was absolute. The silence of the right engine was no longer a malfunction. It was a testament to the fact that the aircraft was now flying on a prayer and the sheer willpower of 3 people, a seasoned captain, an anxious first officer, and a 12-year-old boy who had never sat in a simulator, yet understood the pulse of the machine better than anyone in the tower. "Gear down, flaps at 20. Captain Alessandro barked, his voice stripped of all emotion, leaving only the cold precision of a veteran pilot. Riccardo braced himself against the jump seat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He watched the primary flight display. The speed was falling, but the drag was erratic. The right wing, stripped of its cowling and trailing hydraulic fluid, was stuttering. It was as if the plane itself were fighting the inevitable collapse. "The airspeed is dropping too fast," Marco, the first officer, shouted, his fingers dancing over the flight management system. "The right wing is stalling. We're going to tip." Riccardo's eyes were locked on the slip indicator. He didn't look at the gauges. He felt the aircraft's center of gravity shifting. "Don't fight the roll with the stick," Riccardo warned, his voice cracking slightly but retaining its sharp clarity. "Use the differential throttle on the left engine to keep us centered. If you force the ailerons, the right wing will snap under the strain. Just let her glide in, sir. Just keep her nose up until the very last second." Alessandro trusted the boy. He eased his grip on the side stick, allowing the plane to sway slightly, a dance between death and salvation. They were 100 feet off the runway now. The roar of the left engine, the only heartbeat of the aircraft, was a deafening, comforting drone. The runway lights, a row of pulsating white, surged toward them. "Brace for impact," the captain yelled over the intercom, his voice echoing through the cabin, reaching the ears of 200 terrified passengers. The moment of truth arrived. The main landing gear reached for the tarmac. Riccardo held his breath. As the left gear touched down, a massive cloud of spray erupted from the wet runway. The plane veered violently toward the right, exactly as Riccardo had predicted. Alessandro slammed his foot on the left rudder, pinning the plane to the center line. The screech of burning rubber on asphalt sounded like a scream. The right landing gear struck the ground a fraction of a second later, the metal groaning in a symphony of torture. The vibration was horrific. The entire airframe shuddered, the metal shrieking as it fought to remain whole. Passengers in the cabin were thrown forward against their seatbelts, the force of the deceleration pinning them in place. But the plane didn't flip. It didn't spin out of control. It tracked true, carved by the steady hands of the pilot and the whispered guidance of the boy in the jump seat. "Reverse thrust, now," Riccardo urged. Alessandro pulled back on the levers, engaging the engine reverses. The roar increased, a desperate, guttural sound as the plane fought the inertia of its own weight. The speed bled away. 30 knots, 20 knots, 10 knots. Finally, the aircraft shuddered to a halt, resting silently in the middle of the runway, surrounded by the flashing blue and red lights of emergency vehicles that had been racing alongside them like guardian angels. The cockpit went deathly still. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of heavy, ragged breathing and the soft patter of rain against the windshield. Marco leaned back in his seat, his face ashen, a slow, disbelieving smile spreading across his features. The captain slumped forward, his hands finally releasing the controls. "We made it," Marco whispered. "We actually made it." The cabin, which had been silent with terror only seconds ago, erupted. It started with a single cheer, then a roar of applause, then the sounds of weeping, a mix of relief and hysterical joy. People were hugging one another, oblivious to the fact that their lives had been saved by a stowaway in a frayed shirt. Alessandro turned in his seat. He looked at Riccardo, who was staring out the window at the flashing lights of the fire trucks. The boy looked smaller now, his shoulders slumped with the sudden drain of adrenaline. Alessandro reached out, placing a firm, heavy hand on Riccardo's shoulder. "You didn't just save this plane, son," the captain said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave these people a second chance at life, and you did it by listening to the very machine that everyone else ignored." Riccardo looked up, a small, shy smile appearing for the first time. "It just needed to be heard, sir. My father always said that." The door to the cockpit was flung open by a frantic flight attendant. "Captain, the ground crew is here. Is everyone okay?" Alessandro stood up, tall and proud. "Everyone is safe, but we have a guest to introduce." As they stepped out of the cockpit, the passengers stood up, turning toward the front. The sight that met them wasn't a pilot or a co-pilot, but a thin, dirty-faced boy in a tattered shirt blinking against the bright cabin lights. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The cabin of the aircraft, usually a sterile environment of recycled air and hushed voices, was now a cathedral of raw human emotion. As Captain Alessandra stepped into the aisle with Riccardo trailing behind him, the roar of applause was deafening. Passengers who moments ago had been staring into the abyss of their own mortality now stood on their tiptoes to catch a glimpse of the invisible pilot. Riccardo felt a sudden wave of vertigo. He was used to the shadows of the parking lot, to being scolded by security guards or chased off by taxi drivers. He was not used to being the center of the world. He shrunk back, his eyes fixed on the scuffed toes of his sneakers, but the captain would not allow him to hide. Alessandro placed a gentle but firm hand on the boy's shoulder, guiding him forward until they reached the front of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his voice booming through the cabin's public address system, "this young man is not just a traveler. He's the reason you're all standing here today. He understood the language of this machine when we were blind to it. His name is Riccardo." The cheering intensified. A woman from the third row, who had been clutching her rosary beads in terror just minutes earlier, broke through the crowd and threw her arms around the boy. Riccardo stood rigid, surprised by the warmth, by the scent of expensive perfume and relief. In that moment, the barriers of his life, the poverty, the hunger, the invisibility, seemed to dissolve. Outside the plane, the tarmac of Fiumicino was a hive of activity. Fire crews were already retracting their hoses, and a fleet of airline officials and security personnel was sprinting toward the aircraft stairs. As the cabin door finally hissed open, the cool, rain-washed air of a Roman evening flooded the space. Riccardo stepped out onto the metal staircase, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was quickly surrounded. The airline's operations head, a man in a crisp charcoal suit, looked at Riccardo with a mixture of suspicion and profound awe. "Who authorized this? How did he get on the ramp?" he demanded. Before Riccardo could answer, a voice cut through the chaos, a raspy, deep voice belonging to a man with shock-white hair and a uniform that looked like it had been pressed with care every day for 30 years. It was Signor Srinivasan, the airport's most senior chief engineer, a man who had known every bolt and rivet in the hangar for 40 years. He pushed through the circle of officials, his eyes fixed on the boy. "Wait," Srinivasan said, his voice trembling. He knelt, coming eye to eye with Riccardo. "Boy, look at me. What is your father's name?" Riccardo swallowed hard. "Mario, sir. Mario Bianchi." The crowd went silent. Even the flashing lights of the police cars seemed to dim in the face of the sudden stillness. Srinivasan's face turned an ashen gray. Mario Bianchi, the best technician this airport ever saw. He died during the test run of the prototype engine 5 years ago. The old man reached out, his weathered, grease-stained fingers tracing Riccardo's jawline. "I see him. Every line, every shadow. I thought he had no children left." "I was there," Riccardo whispered, his voice cracking. "I remember the hangar. I remember the smell of the engine oil. I remember him telling me that if the machine hums in B-flat, the turbine is perfectly balanced." Srinivasan stood up, his eyes glassy. He turned to the operations head. "This is not a stowaway, sir. This is a legacy. This boy didn't break into the plane. He came home to it." The aftermath was a whirlwind. There was no police station, no jail cell. Instead, there was a quiet office in the central terminal. The airline, humbled by the miracle of the landing, declared that they would take full responsibility for Riccardo's life. They didn't just offer him a reward, they offered him a future. They enrolled him in the prestigious Leonardo da Vinci Academy of Aviation, covering his tuition, his housing, and his living expenses, a debt they claimed for the lives of every person on flight IA-902. Years passed, and the image of the dirty-faced boy and the frayed shirt faded, replaced by something much more permanent. The Fiumicino tarmac remained a place of great activity, but now a young man in a crisp white pilot's uniform stood near the nose gear of a departing flight. He held a tablet in his hand, checking the logs, but his eyes were not on the screen. He was listening. He closed his eyes, tilting his head just slightly as the massive engines began to whine. He heard the friction, the vibration, the beautiful, complex harmony of titanium and air. "Sir, is everything okay?" a junior technician asked, looking at the young man with admiration. "Everything's green on the monitor." Riccardo Bianchi smiled, a smile that carried the wisdom of 1,000 hours spent in the shadows and the confidence of a pilot who knew that no machine was ever truly alone, provided someone cared enough to listen. "Yes," Riccardo said, his voice resonant and sure. "The engine is happy. It's ready to fly." As the plane pushed back, beginning its long journey toward the stars, Riccardo watched it climb. He was no longer the invisible passenger. He was the master of his own horizon, a boy who had once been broken by the sky and had spent his life learning how to hold it together. The legacy of his father wasn't just in the blood that ran through his veins. It was in the silence he understood and the courage he had found when the world was shaking beneath his feet. He turned toward the hangar, ready for his own shift to begin, knowing that every time a plane soared above Rome, a part of him was flying with it.